Well, I could just make a brief introduction of Dr. Smith here and explain that in her efforts and research that she currently is with the National Institute on Drug Abuse. She's a postdoctoral fellow there and is working in the translational addiction medicine branch. She has been investigating real world instances of kratom use since 2017, and she will be continuing her kratom research at Johns Hopkins University Behavioral Pharmacology Research Unit as an assistant professor beginning in August of 2023. And we're grateful that she was able to join us here today.
Thank you for that introduction. Let me share my screen. Good afternoon, everybody. And we can see this, correct? Yes. All right. So it's an honor to be here to present on our current understanding of kratom product use in the United States. I'm going to be presenting some unpublished data from our lab at NIDA's intramural research program. But first, who is using kratom in the United States? So we know that on average, adults are in their mid-30s. Most samples are a slight majority male, educated, mostly upwards of 80% non-Hispanic white. Those who use regularly are using less than 20 grams per day of the whole plant matter. So that's pulverized, either encapsulated or in warm water solution or taken just orally. Doses are 2 to 3 times per day on average. We see extract use increasing in the United States, but we have no prevalence estimates for this yet. My limited research indicates that among people who are using kratom regularly, they do not use extracts regularly due to cost and potency. So we don't have a lot of information on that, but we're keeping an eye on it. Case reports are all we have to go on to understand what the upper limits of dosing are. So anything more than 30 grams per day is typically reported in these case reports, but we actually have very few such reports globally or in the United States. So we don't know a lot about upper limits of dosing. I want to show some of our data from this remote study that we just completed, specifically the 15 days of ecological momentary assessment, where we had participants enter data at random and scheduled intervals into a study smartphone app. And then of the 357 participants who completed that phase, we have 330 who also sent a kratom product sample of what they were taking during the EMA phase. Our collaborators and we are in the process of analyzing those data now. But I want to show motivations for a minute. So this is something we really care about understanding in the US because it helps us understand kratom itself. So here are dozens of motivations for use that we found in our sample and have found in other samples. And specifically, it's important to stress that people are using for multiple motivations, not just one. Here we see that perceived kratom safety is widely endorsed. Also, a very robust narrative of harm reduction with kratom has been solidified in the past 10 years in the United States. So specifically here, we have 100 participants who are using as a long-term opioid substitute. We also see this with alcohol increasingly as well, and we're keeping an eye on that because it's of great interest again, in this harm reduction substitution manner. We see self-treatment of anxiety and depressive symptoms, attenuation of withdrawal, also reported, and increasingly this broad quality of life issue. So people might have very specific reasons such as pain relief or increasing energy and productivity, but oftentimes they're also reporting that kratom kind of fits in with their quality of life in general. Looking at our dosing data, so we had over 12,000 unique kratom use events reported during the EMA phase. We were able to do a cluster analysis with these and determine a high and low dosing cluster, as well as those in between. And I should say this is dosing frequency, not just the amount of per dose. And you can see that for all of our groups, people are tending to use in the first half of their waking hours or whatever their day is, not the latter half, which again fits in with this kind of productivity use of kratom. So looking at some of these motivations I just showed a moment ago, again, there are dozens of these. These are just a few I'm highlighting to know that we didn't have many differences across our dosing groups. One area we did see a difference was that for the people who are using as a long-term opioid substitute, these folks actually we're more likely to be taking kratom more regularly or dosing more frequently, not necessarily higher doses, but just more regular and frequent dosing. And this group, interestingly, was also more likely to report kratom as being life-saving, but also habit-forming. And in some ways, there's a few levels of interpretation there, but because we know that this group is taking it fairly regularly, kind of almost like a maintenance medication, that we would expect to see dosing patterns differ for this group. When we look at proximal motivations for use, so these are dynamic. These change from hour to hour, day to day. And in our EMA assessment, what we found is that pain relief was the clear winner. People are using to try to reduce pain, followed by wanting to improve mood, increase energy, productivity, focus, alertness. So you see the analgesic effects of kratom and the stimulatory effects of kratom being sought out. These two are not mutually exclusive, so people could report more than one. Also, this generally wanting to feel good, which I should note is different from wanting to feel high, which we also assessed, and that was endorsed at a far lower rate. So again, people really wanting to have this productivity and pain relief. When we look at DSM-5 diagnostic criteria for substance use disorder when assessed for kratom, and this sample across all of our groups, the mean number of symptoms was less than 4 on average, and was lowest for this cluster E, which was the least frequent dosing group. I would say severity levels were actually fairly similar across these groups, but again, across all groups for both lifetime and past year substance use disorder when assessed for kratom, mean number of symptoms was again less than 4. So when we unpack this, what we see is looking a lot like dependence, which is distinguishable from addiction. By that, I mean specifically tolerance and withdrawal symptoms. We do see craving, some unsuccessful attempts to reduce use, using more than intended. What we do not see here, and what we have not seen in any of our prior work, are impairments in psychosocial functioning, role obligation interference, hazardous use. This is not something that we have seen. And I should note, in a systematic review that we completed recently, our group found only 55 cases globally. When we searched widely for anything like kratom addiction, tolerance, misuse, abuse, dependent, whatever term you want to use, we were only able to find 55 cases globally, which really indicates that the clinical footprint of kratom use disorder or addiction is very, very scarce, for lack of a better term. We're just not seeing this show up, and it's not showing up in the literature. In keeping with roles and obligations and daily life functioning, what we see here is that when participants assessed kratom effects and how they fit in with their daily lifestyle at the end of each day. So this was a daily diary that participants completed. And we can see that on the whole, people are reporting that kratom effects are compatible with, if not helpful in them meeting their daily roles and obligations, and likewise with productivity. What we don't see is this hindrance with kratom effects impairing or hindering their ability to live out their lives. We do see some group differences here. Nothing was striking or major. But again, on the whole, we're seeing this kind of compatibility of kratom effects and daily life. For a small sub-study that we did, we wanted to take real-world kratom use and see what it looks like in the lab under observation. So these are regularly using adults, dosing anywhere, in our sample, their self-administration was 1.1 to 10.9 grams. And briefly, I just want to say that we assessed pre and post dosing across a variety of measures. We have some other data that we're still analyzing. I just want to say from a very high level that there were no changes in respiration rates, cognitive performance. We saw some minor changes pre and post dosing for some of the drug effects questionnaires and SALs that were driven by, I would say, 2 of our only 10 participants. And I will say there was a clear trend with pupil diameter changes. Those did have a clear direction, and we will be publishing those data in the near future. But I want to draw your attention finally to our driving simulation data. So this is just a few, these are just a few of the many tasks that were assessed with this driving simulation that you can see here. And for no task were there any statistically significant differences at the group level pre and post kratom product self-administration. So there were no impairing effects essentially. And what we see here is that when we look at something like alcohol or THC, so this is the same task, which we could do for all of these as well, exact same machine actually. And what we see with a different sample, not this sample, but clear impairing effects both at the group level and at the level of the individual. We don't see that with kratom. And again, these are 2 different samples, so I want to make clear that this is for illustrative purposes. But here, what we see is some variation within our group. In fact, some people actually improved their performance after taking their kratom product. Some showed a decline in performance, but not consistently. On any task, no participant clearly trended in any one direction. Rather, there's just a lot more noise and variance in here than we would expect to see for something like alcohol or THC. So with that, I'm going to note that we do need a lot more research, particularly human laboratory studies, to assess the effects of kratom products as well as kratom alkaloid and alkaloid combinations. And with that, I will hand it over to Dr. Jack Henningfield.